Bryan Greene is Vice President of Policy Advocacy at the National Association of Realtors, where he oversees all legislative and regulatory advocacy on behalf of the association's 1.4 million members. Bryan joined NAR in November 2019 and spent his first year at NAR raising the association's profile in Washington and nationwide on all fair housing related policy matters as NAR's first Director of Fair Housing Policy. Before joining NAR, Bryan served for 10 years as the highest ranking career official in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, FHEO, where he oversaw the policy direction and operational management of a 600-person office enforcing the nation's housing anti-discrimination laws. Under Bryan's leadership as FHEO General Deputy Assistant Secretary, HUD pursued large-scale, high-profile cases that addressed systemic discrimination and provided widespread relief. Bryan also maintained HUD's Fair Housing Assistance Program and HUD's Fair Housing Initiatives Program, which together provided over $70 million to state and local government agencies and nonprofit organizations fighting discrimination in local communities. Bryan has held other senior positions at HUD during his 3 decades at the agency, including a stint as the Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Affairs in HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research, where he worked to reduce regulatory barriers to affordable housing. Bryan was the 2007 recipient of the Presidential Rank Award, the highest federal honor bestowed upon federal senior executives for outstanding service. Bryan earned his degree in government from Harvard University. Bryan, we welcome you.
Thank you, Margot. It's great to be with you all. And just want to give a special shout out to all of you in King County on Martin Luther King Day. Just really an honor to address a group who live somewhere that's actually named now for this great leader whose birthday we celebrate today. Greetings to everyone throughout Washington State, and I want to thank you all for having me today at the beginning of your legislative week and on Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday as you kick it off. And today is a great opportunity to give tribute to one of our nation's greatest legislative advocates. And of course, I'm talking about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. If you think about it, while we often talk about him as a great civil rights leader, human rights activist, he is also perhaps our nation's greatest and most successful legislative advocate. We have Dr. King to thank for a raft of civil rights legislation that has transformed our society. So consider the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which opened up public accommodations for all Americans. I know personally that the passage of this law changed the lives of not just millions throughout the United States, but my own parents, who spent the first 30 years of their lives unable to simply go into certain places or unable to go places without harassment, humiliation, and possible threat of violence, government-sanctioned violence. So we have the 1964 Civil Rights Act to thank Dr. King for. Of course, we have the 1965 Voting Rights Act to thank Dr. King for. And this is the law that guaranteed full political rights for all people in the United States, regardless of race, color, national origin. And effectively with, that being the most important right in a democracy, truly providing full citizenship rights for all Americans, despite a 14th Amendment passed in the 19th century. Really, it's the 1965 Civil Rights Act that finally fully guaranteed those rights for all Americans. Many people don't know that, well, many people know of Dr. King's famous 1963 speech, "I Have a Dream," at the Lincoln Memorial. But many people don't know that was not the first address that Dr. King made at the Lincoln Memorial. He actually gave a speech there in 1957 called "Give Us the Ballot." And so he and 25,000 civil rights activists in 1957, right off the Montgomery bus boycott, were in Washington, not far from where I am right now, speaking on the importance of voting rights then. And they were petitioning President Eisenhower. And King gave this great speech called "Give Us the Ballot," which you can find on YouTube if you haven't heard it. Lesser known than "I Have a Dream," but there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial is Dr. King. Just looked at a video of that this morning. And that really was the first national campaign of the civil rights movement. And it did help with the passage that year of the 1957 Civil Rights Act, the first major civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, since 1875. And we have Dr. King to thank for helping pass that law. That law created the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. It was not a very strong law, but of course a beginning. And this came 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education. So if you listen to the speech, you will hear him, and if you listen to the whole rally, you'll hear others talk about how the Supreme Court had decided Brown versus Board, but throughout the American South, segregation persisted, and that they were coming to Washington because life was not changing, and that they needed voting rights so that African Americans actually have a place in deciding their destiny and ensuring that these rights were enforced. This speech also was helpful in getting the Eisenhower administration to enforce desegregation of schools. It was the same year that Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard to protect children going to school in Little Rock. So that was the foundation for the 1965 Voting Rights Act, what they did there in 1957. And then finally, of course, Dr. King was a great advocate for fair housing rights. In 1966, Dr. King moved to Chicago and lived there for nearly a year to advocate for passage of open housing laws. He came north to dramatize that it was not just the South that was maintaining segregation. While the South maintained it officially, in the North, all life was still very much segregated, and certainly in our communities, that African Americans could not purchase or rent property throughout the metropolitan area, but instead were confined, as Dr. King said, to slums, and that in our northern cities, we had effectively two cities. We had the general city and the general economy, and what he called the slum economy, with slum housing, slum schools, slum education, using his words. And so he came north to dramatize this and just how there was systemic discrimination that confined African Americans to these limited opportunities. And he lived in North Lawndale in Chicago to illustrate this point. Now, anyone who's a student of Chicago may know that North Lawndale is still a very impoverished, neglected community, which reminds us that we still have these challenges today. In fact, Dr. King's advocacy did result in the passage of the 1968 Civil Rights Act, but this has been perhaps the hardest battle, desegregating housing, creating diverse and inclusive communities. When Dr. King was in Chicago, he described the campaign for fair housing rights as more violent than what he encountered even in the South. And if you've seen the video footage of him marching through Cicero, there were threats on his life the entire time. He had bricks thrown at him. I believe he was even hit by a brick at one point. So he just described this as one of the greatest challenges and one of the most systemic challenges in communities where there were not laws literally separating people, but social practice and business practices. And so the 1968 Civil Rights Act was necessary to begin dismantling these practices. And King did not live to see the passage of the 1968 Civil Rights Act. He was assassinated on April 4th, while that act was still tied up in the Congress. But President Johnson then did push for its passage, and exactly a week after Dr. King's assassination and following a week of civil unrest, the Congress finally passed the Fair Housing Act. Interesting, I'm at the National Association of Realtors and handle our policy advocacy. I just came upon an article from April 1st, 1968, where in a Realtor publication, where the head of the Realtors Washington Committee decried efforts to pass fair housing legislation. Our association was opposed to its passage, and this official from NAR said that politicians were saying it's a political reality that we must pass fair housing legislation, although he said they are pushing us to pass what he called forced housing. And he said that the real political reality in America is that people don't want this. They don't want this, quote, forced housing. And he described it as forced housing because he advocated that all people should have the right to deny housing to people they consider undesirable, that was a core value in America and a core value concerning property rights. So he said that's the real political reality. Of course, he was not foresighted. Just 10 days later, the real political reality after a harrowing week was that the country did pass this legislation. But what he may have been correct about was the struggle to truly realize fair housing in this country. We actually today still struggle to recognize a problem. Our association has done some surveys looking at this question and what we understand about housing discrimination in this country. And still, fully half of our membership state that they do not believe or recognize that discrimination still occurs today, despite many high-profile examples of discrimination that still occurs in the housing market. So we have a job to do. I think many people believe we have realized Dr. King's dream when still we have a great many challenges left. At the National Association of Realtors, we have said it is time to act, to do more. Margot informed you that when I first started at NAR about 14 months ago, I started as the director of fair housing. And one of the initiatives I launched was something called ACT, calling on greater accountability, culture change, and training in our industry to realize the dream of fair housing. Realize the law of fair housing as has been law since 1968 when Dr. King passed. And so we have a ways to go. No doubt we have many, many members who are leaders in this area. One of our goals this year is to highlight some of those leaders and what those leaders are doing throughout the country. Many leaders here in Washington State, in fact, we're hoping to profile some of the leaders in Washington State on fair housing in some of these initiatives this year. But we have a ways to go. But it is helpful for all of us to learn from peers in our industry how we can ensure fair housing and how fair housing actually benefits all, benefits our economy, benefits our whole nation. So that is a priority. But beyond that, we want to make sure that we have strong fair housing laws. We are talking about state licensing laws and how state licensing laws can be stronger to ensure fair housing. Some states may have some reference to fair housing, but no specific requirement, say for fair housing education, no minimum number of hours of fair housing education to get your license, or no minimum number of hours for fair housing to renew your license. Some states may not even make a fair housing violation a basis for losing your license. Sometimes people say, you know, that real estate agents don't engage in discrimination because if they do, they could lose their license. In some states, you won't, or the law is unclear because it doesn't explicitly say that. And so we are looking forward to providing some review of our state licensing laws so that states can look at these laws and see if they can strengthen them. So that is part of our hope for legislatures throughout the country, that they will take a closer look at their laws and promote laws that will make a meaningful difference in terms of fair housing for all people. So there's a lot we can still do to achieve Dr. King's dream. But I think he was prescient in recognizing in the late 60s that this was hard. This was hard because we're actually talking about the most intimate sphere of people's lives. So we were able, with 64 Act, to deal with public accommodations, with the 1965 Act to deal with political rights. But when it comes to this social sphere that the 1968 Civil Rights Act deals with, we still struggle. And so as many people think it's easy to say, don't discriminate, or they dismiss fair housing as, oh, yeah, I know that. We are actually finding this remains one of the most challenging areas because of social and other pressures. Let me conclude by saying I saw that Bernice King, Dr. King's daughter, put out a tweet today just reminding people that while we do as a nation venerate Dr. King today, in 1967, she said, Dr. King was among the most hated Americans. And, you know, she suggested that, you know, many people who invoke his name today, if they were around in his time, might have reviled him. And I think that's really important for us to remember, that Dr. King really was ahead of his time. And the issues he was pushing for our country at that time were difficult for many of us to accept. But with time, we discovered he was right about these things. And so I just want to leave you with that thought, that when it comes to this sphere, you know, when we talk about civil rights, when we talk about fair housing, it is important as leaders to stick to our guns, to be foresighted and not shrink, that political realities do change. And when it comes to universal rights, we have to be strong. And I think Dr. King said it best, so I will leave you with a Dr. King quote. He said, when it comes to issues, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but one must take it because one's conscience tells one that it is right. So I want to thank you for having me today. Have a wonderful Dr. King's birthday, and have a wonderful legislative week. Thanks a lot.